Global supply chains are facing a very chaotic crisis that only seems to get worse. While some bottlenecks ease, others are just starting. With each passing day, new shortages emerge around the world due to delivery delays, shipping disruptions, and a record congestion of cargo ships at ports. The network of world trade is also being plagued by container backlogs, labor shortages, geopolitical tensions, energy shortages, travel restrictions, and lockdowns. The combination of these factors is creating a ripple effect all over the planet, but especially in the United States. For that reason, analysts at Capital Economics are predicting the supply chain crisis to last for at least another 2 years. We do not see major improvements as long as we have a line of sight, which is into 2022. Very likely that it continues thereafter, and for North America, even longer, they wrote in a recent note. But have you ever wondered why supply chains have become so tangled up? Or what's the root of the supply chain collapse? In an article brilliantly written by the economist and financial commentator James Rickards, which was recently published in his blog, The Daily Reckoning, the analyst explains that there's no simple answer for that question. In fact, he says that supply chains are so complex that the answer is essentially irrelevant. It's a very intricate network whose scale and complexity can be compared to an ecosystem. That's why paying attention to the exact cause and effect to get to the root of the problem can be a dead end. The processing power needed to understand the entanglement of supply chains exceeds our logic comprehension. Even though most of us have a notion of how supply chains operate, only a few people in the world truly understand how elaborate, extensive, and vulnerable they really are. That's why Rickards breaks down this complex explanation into a simple example to show us why one single failure can lead to a cascade of disruptions and cause unimaginable damages. Let's picture a single loaf of bread. If you go to the store to buy a loaf of bread, you know that the bread did not mystically appear on the shelf, Rickards writes. It was delivered by a local bakery, put on the shelf by a clerk, you carried it home, served it with dinner. That's a succinct description of a supply chain, from baker to store to home, he continues. However, that description barely scratches the surface. For that loaf of bread to arrive at the store, a truck driver has to pick it up from the bakery. The bakery needs one or more suppliers to get all of the ingredients needed to make the bread. The ovens used to bake it and the packing used to wrap it when it's ready are also an essential part of the process that allows you to bring that loaf of bread home. So where did those come from? Even that expanded description of a supply chain is just getting started in terms of a complete chain, the analyst says. The flour used in that bread came from wheat. That wheat was grown on a farm and harvested with heavy equipment. The farmer hires labor, uses water and fertilizer, sends his wheat out for processing and packaging before it gets to the bakery, Rickards explains. The manufacturer of the oven also needs its own supply chain to provide him with steel, tempered glass, semiconductors, electrical circuits, and other materials needed to build his product. The ovens can be handcrafted or mass-produced in a factory that requires production lines or manufacturing cells to assemble the product. For its part, the factory also needs its own supply chain of electricity, natural gas, heating, ventilation systems, and qualified labor to make its entire operation work. So, the store that sells the bread needs only the receiver of a product that required numerous supply chains to exist. The store also needs electricity, natural gas, heating, and ventilation systems, and qualified workers to keep the doors open and merchandise on the shelves. Every store requires warehouses or back rooms to keep the inventory, as well as loading docks, forklifts, conveyor belts to move their merchandise from truck to shelf. Every link in these supply chains requires transportation, Rickards highlights. From the farmer that produces wheat and needs of deliveries of seeds, fertilizers, and equipment by truck or by rail, to the oven manufacturer who needs all of its components to be delivered as well. From the bakery to the store, and even consumers need transportation to get to the store and come back home. All of these transportation forms also have their own supply chains, which include truck drivers, train engineers, roads, railroads, rail spurs, energy supplies to move goods around and deliver them on time. This entire network, farms, factories, bakeries, stores, trucks, railroads, and consumers, relies on energy supplies to keep working. The energy can come from nuclear reactors, coal-fired or natural gas-fired power plants, or renewable sources fed to a grid of high-tension wires, substations, transformers, and local connections to reach the individual user, he explains. Every process that has been described so far forms the intricate supply chain needed to produce a single loaf of bread. Now, imagine all of the other items available at grocery stores: fresh produce, fruits, meat, pork, fish, poultry, canned goods, dairy, drinks, spices, and so on. Each of them requires the operations of several supply chains to be produced, processed, packed, and transported to finally get to store shelves. So, consider all of the other stores in the shopping center: appliances, electronics, apparel, home goods, pharmacy, hardware, restaurants, sporting goods, etc. And picture all the products and services provided by those vendors and the supply chains behind each and every one of them. In case you think I have exaggerated the components and steps in making a loaf of bread in the above example, I didn't, the analyst stressed. In fact, the example he gave is still a simplified explanation of the complexity of the supply chain. A full description of the needed supply chain would reach back further. Where do the seeds for the wheat come from? And branch off in tangential directions. Where do the bread wrappers originate? A full description of the loaf of bread supply chain with a choice of vendor analysis, quality control tests, and bulk purchase discounts, among other decision tree branches, could easily stretch to several hundred pages, Rickards continues. Things are much more entangled than they seem. The truth is that the processes described in all of those supply chain links and the possible disruptions each one of them can suffer are limited to a domestic environment. But in our modern era, only a few supply chains operate on a local level. CEOs, logistics engineers, consultants, and politicians have spent the last 30 years making supply chains global, the Economist outlines. Since the early 1990s, we've been hearing discussions about globalization. What most people don't realize is that the process that was being globalized was the supply chain. For instance, most electronics we use in America are manufactured in China, but the special glass used in them comes from South Korea, while the semiconductors needed to make them work come from Taiwan. And in some cases, the intellectual property and design of that smartphone, they're all exported from America. One single iPhone needs flash storage that comes from Japan, gyroscopes produced in Germany, audio amplifiers, battery chargers, display port multiplexes, batteries, cameras, hundreds of other advanced parts. In total, Apple works with suppliers in 43 countries on 6 continents to source the materials and parts that go into an iPhone. Now that's a quick overview of the iPhone supply chain, Rickards describes. Evidently, every manufacturer and every supplier across the supply chain needs its own network of sources and processes. By turning these processes global, transportation alternatives expanded from trucks and trains to ships and planes, which means that ports and airports are also essential connections of these chains. Each one of those facilities have their own operating systems and key equipment such as vessels, chassis, cranes, containers, and essential workers to get things moving, including local authorities, dock workers, sailors, air traffic controllers, pilots, captains, truck drivers, warehouse workers, and so forth. And for these transportation modes to work, we need pipelines to transport oil, gasoline, natural gas. Although some of these elements are hidden, they are everywhere. They connect this densely networked and unimaginably complex chain we all rely on. The main turning point for the supply chain was the just-in-time model of production. According to the analyst, if you're installing seats on an automobile assembly line, it is ideal if those seats arrive at the plant the same morning as the installation. That minimizes storage and inventory costs. The same is true for every part installed on the assembly line. The logistics behind this are daunting, but can be managed with state-of-the-art software. All these efforts are fine as far as they go. The cost savings are real. The supply chains are efficient. The capacity of this system to keep a lid on costs is demonstrable. That is to say, the process of globalization was fundamentally about cost reduction, which ultimately means that companies are willing to outsource their production to offer lower prices to their customers. The big problem is that the just-in-time model has made the whole system extremely fragile. One single disruption can compromise the operations of the entire global supply chain. One delivery delay can result in the closure of an entire factory or cause a number of shortages that will leave store shelves empty for an indefinite period of time. One single blackout can aggravate port congestion for months. The system is not prepared to handle external shocks, but those shocks are happening on an everyday basis. The health crisis, the ever-given accident, trade conflicts, port shutdowns, financial swings, and many more factors can weigh upon the system. That is why supply chains have collapsed. The bottom line, as Rickards concludes, is that if the supply chains collapse, the economy starts to collapse as well. Every item, product, and service that keeps our economy running requires a series of supply chains to exist. When the economy starts to fall apart, our social order begins to fall to pieces just as well. And the price to pay for social disorder is far higher than any savings that the just-in-time model can offer. Sadly, our leaders are failing to assess the severity of this situation, and we are already feeling the impact of a broken system and a slumping economy. The global supply chain crisis is far from over, and the chaos that is about to emerge goes far beyond our imagination.